Welcome to Real-ationship Goals, a podcast all about the realities of healthy relationships. Real-ationship Goals is a project of the Advocacy Center for Crime Victims and Children in Waco, Texas. If you or someone you know has experienced sexual violence or harassment and is seeking support, services, or needs more information, links to resources and our hotline number can be found in the description. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of their organizations or affiliates. Welcome back to season 4 of Real-ationship Goals. This is episode 3. My name is Allie.
I'm Mariana.
I'm Blythe. And I'm Kyla.
And we're so glad you've joined us for our episode today. Okay, I have a story today. I think it's gonna be pretty short because it's such a general theme in my life that I don't have to tell a specific story. No, it's on me. So I, for whatever reason, like if I am with a friend, and this is like throughout my whole life, if I'm with a friend and we are talking about, like, let's say something we both want to do, like maybe there's a new restaurant in town, right? And we're both talking about like, yes, I want to go to that restaurant. Then for whatever reason, what my brain does is like, oh, we have just committed to going to that restaurant together. Like if it's a new restaurant, like going for the first time, like whatever, together, or to, it could be, I'm just using a restaurant as an example. But the thing about that is that only happens in my brain. It doesn't ever make it out like with words. So that my friend is also aware of that sort of expectation that I have, or this, whatever that I've set in my mind is going to happen. And so then sometimes it works out like that, and that's great. But also what happens is that friend goes ahead and does that thing with someone else or by themselves or whatever the deal is. And then they tell me about it, and then I'm disappointed. And, that's on me 100%. But that is like that is something that I've had to really kind of like learn, and it's been a long learning process, I would say. But so getting disappointed when that happens.
You telling that story just made me realize that that's what I do all the time with Everett, my partner. And I never even fully realized, because in my head I was like, oh, we talked about this and we've established like, oh, like we should go to that sometime. And then he'll do it like either with somebody else or something, and that always hurts. And now I've just realized, he just isn't reading that the same way. You just solved so much hurt in my life. Now I know
glad to help.
We should go together to do that and share in that experience for the first time. So, oh, thank you for that.
You're welcome. I'll be here all day.
Yes, Allie, thank you for sharing that story. I think quite a few of us can relate to that, even myself. So in this season, we're talking about uncomfortable feelings and what to do about them. This episode, we're talking about disappointment. And disappointment sometimes can be a response to unmet expectations. And just to know, it's a normal feeling to have when we interact with people and that we're in relationships with, and relationships that we build over time. We're going to dive more into like what it means to have expectations, and knowing that it's not necessarily a bad thing to have with relationships, but also just reflecting on what it means to have good standards and within those, and just how to respond in a healthy manner when it comes to addressing disappointment.
As we just talked about, one of the big things about expectations that can lead then to disappointment when they're unmet is like, you have to communicate those expectations. And sometimes that's hard because you can get like, for me, my experience is like, well, I don't actually want to communicate that expectation because I know in my head that it feels unreasonable. And so like, that would be embarrassing to communicate that expectation because I know it's not reasonable, or maybe even like not healthy, like that sort of thing. Right. But this is really close to something we've referenced before on the podcast, Brene Brown's, like the story you're making up in your head, which is slightly different. That is when we're talking about that, we're saying like something happens, and then internally you make up a story about why that happened, why someone reacted in that way, or why a situation played out in a certain way. And so this is sort of adjacent to that. If we're not communicating our expectations, then we can't really expect them to be met, because that other person cannot read our minds, right? So like, you know, maybe that's having an experience for the first time, like I talked about in my story and that Kyla talked about. It could also be like holidays. I think holidays are a really tricky space for this. You might have an expectation around how much time you spend with your partner, or if you like where you go to spend a holiday, or even like, you know, Valentine's Day is coming up or has just passed.
I don't know what day it is.
Okay. It's around the time that you'll be hearing this episode. But that it can be a tricky place for people who are in romantic relationships, because one partner may have an expectation that like we go all out for Valentine's Day, gifts, fancy dinner, date, all the things, right? And the other partner is like, I mean, that's just a day on the calendar, you know? And so that can lead to a lot of disappointment when there are those sort of like spoken expectations.
Yeah. I think as before we get too deep into this episode, one thing I want to acknowledge, and like it is so important, like we should be communicating our expectations, because fortunately and unfortunately, like our friends, our partners, our parents, people we're in relationships with, like cannot read our minds. And so if we don't communicate something, like how can we expect someone to know what we want, or something like that? And so it's good to communicate our expectations, but I think we need to remember like expectations aren't demands, and like talking and communicating about expectations like has to be mutual. It has to be a conversation, or else it can get really unhealthy and controlling if someone's saying, well, I always expect that we do this. And if that doesn't happen, I don't know, XYZ or something like that. Obviously, of course, we should all expect like the people we're in relationships with to treat us respectfully and kindly, and honestly, like we should expect healthy things, full stop. But like as we're talking about like Valentine's Day or something like that, or just other things like communicating like, hey, I'm bringing this expectation forward. Like, how do you feel about that? Like maybe you're saying, I want to go all out on Valentine's Day. I expect that I wake up and there are candles everywhere, and there are balloons, and there are 80 roses, or something like that. There's a lot of roses. And like you might have an expectation, I want this holiday to be big, and maybe, you know, your partner or your Valentine, maybe they're not your partner, whoever, is like, I don't share that expectation. I want to make this holiday special for you, but let's just say I don't have the funds to get you, or I have a job that starts at 6 a.m. and so I can't do this thing, or like, yes, I want to compromise with you. I think as we talk about expectations, we have to talk about compromise. And even sometimes when you compromise with someone, there's still disappointment because you're not fully getting what you want. And that's okay. I guess like disappointment is hard, but sometimes like an okay emotion to feel. I just wanted to insert that.
Yeah. What about like places or relationships where we're not really able to or invited to share our expectations? Does that make sense? Like I'm thinking like school, work, it's like my expectation, teacher, is that I don't have any homework, or my expectation, boss, is that you give me a whatever percent raise, you know? So, I mean, you could share that. Let me backtrack on that bossing. I think you could share that if you believe what you're doing, you should be getting paid more. But like, let's say about like school, or even like on a team, like my expectation is that I start on varsity or whatever. And you know, that might not be the coach's assessment. So what do we do? What do we do with that disappointment?
I think the first thing is like just acknowledge that you feel disappointed. Because like we, especially like all of those things, especially like that's like whether it's a team environment or there are so many factors outside of our control. I mean, like if you want to shoot your shot and say like, I expect to not have homework, and then to be like, well, that is not how this works. I think maybe like just start with acknowledging that we feel disappointed, or that we feel angry, maybe that we feel upset. Like I really wanted to make varsity, I made JV, maybe you're not even on the team. I think that's a good start, but
Mhm.
other thoughts to follow that.
I think recognizing that feeling and accepting, like, it's always okay to feel disappointed. Like, as long as you don't allow those feelings of like disappointment to lead and bleed into feelings of like
Mm.
resentment,
Mhm.
or holding a grudge,
Mhm.
which spoilers coming soon, so keep an eye out. But like not allowing those feelings to fester into like something deeper.
Mhm.
And sometimes I think like after you connect with those feelings, you just kind of got to move on in some instances, of like recognizing of like, oh, that really hurts. I'm disappointed, and that's
Mhm.
okay. And now I guess I'll just try something else. Maybe I'll
Mhm.
try out for a different team, or I'll start a
Mhm.
new hobby, or like, oh, I'm trying to think of like also like we've talked about like some relatively big things, like especially in relationships with like holidays, but I'm also thinking of like smaller disappointments
Mhm.
of like, oh, I did something that I think is really cool, or I'm doing something really cool, and I shared that with my partner, and they weren't really excited, or they didn't think it was really
Mhm.
cool.
Mhm.
And that it's not like a big like, oh, like we have to break up
Mhm.
now, but it's
Yeah,
more just
yeah.
kind of like a, oh, like that just kind of, it's like a little pinprick to the heart a little
Mhm.
bit.
Mhm.
It's like I'm thinking of how you kind of have to, and you communicate that feeling,
Mhm.
but there's some instances where you just kind of have to go, oh, that was kind of stinky, and then move on to the next thing.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah. You touched a little bit on this, Kyla, but what are, like, when I'm thinking about disappointment,
Mhm.
what are some other feelings that can like either come from disappointment that like disappointment sort of leads us to, or that can also be surrounding, I'm thinking back to like our rejection episode a little bit, because definitely disappointment can, I think, will likely happen if you are rejected in some way. But
Mhm.
what are some other feelings, and how do we, Kyla talked about this just a little bit just now, and like how do we manage those? And maybe that is just like, okay, acknowledge the feeling and move on. But what are some of those like other
Anger,
Mhm.
like you might be disappointed and then get really, or feel disappointed and angry. Yeah, is one.
Sadness,
Mhm.
be very sad about it.
Mhm.
Yeah, and then also with anger, sometimes if it's a major like disappointment, it can lead into maybe physical like altercations, and that is an unhealthy way to
Mhm.
respond to disappointment.
Mhm.
So that is another way of looking at how anger affects that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I don't know if this is quite like a feeling that's associated with it. But like sometimes we, like when we feel disappointment, it like reveals that we had an expectation that we didn't even know that we had. And so, which like can bring confusion of just like, why am I feeling disappointed about, or like clarity is something that can come along too. So I guess in that way, sometimes disappointment is like difficult to feel, but like helpful, in that it like shows us kind of the gaps of like, oh, I didn't realize I had that expectation. Yeah. Okay, let's just say you have a friend and you do something, you go to a restaurant without them, even though you had previously talked about it
Too soon.
like what advice would you give to, like, whether it's friends or partners, to like navigate if one person comes to another person and says, hey, this happened, and it made me feel disappointed, or like I'm realizing that like I have this expectation, and maybe this is too general of a question and we can like make it specific, but like what do you think is a like healthy, safe, good way to like kind of navigate that conversation, especially if you're on the receiving end of someone sharing a disappointment that they experience, like maybe an expectation that they have?
That's good.
That's some good hard questions.
That's good, but I think it's important to think about, and certainly to, in each of your relationships, I think being open and to receive that feedback, but then also being able to like share your perspective and say like if it's me and I'm sort of on the receiving end of me saying like, hey, I had really thought that we were going to go to that thing, that restaurant, that event, whatever, together because we had talked about it. And at that point, if I'm at the point where I'm like, I can see that like that was something I just thought in my head. I didn't say
Mm.
that to you. So I just want you to know that I feel disappointed about it. I'm not necessarily saying you did anything wrong.
Mm.
And so I think with that, like just being compassionate
Mhm.
and saying like, yeah, you're right. Like I can't read your mind. So I would
Mhm.
love if you could like think about communicating that to me, or those sort of things to me more. I also like have things that I know that I expect that I don't always communicate well. So,
Mhm.
I'm sorry that this was disappointing to you. Let's like make a plan to like
Mhm.
going forward with how we handle that. So I think being compassionate,
Mhm.
that's a pretty like reasonable low stakes disappointment. So I think obviously higher
Mhm.
stakes
Yeah.
maybe elicits a different response.
I think that, and this could just be a me thing,
Mhm.
because I tend to find myself as a relatively people pleasing oriented person. So like if I even if it's not directly communicated, but if I perceive that like I have hurt somebody in some way, I'm gonna just sit and stew on that for like forever.
Mm.
So I think that like one of the important things that it's good for me and healthy for me to keep in mind is kind of like you said, Allie, of just like I'm not a mind reader, and it's like I didn't do this thing to like intentionally hurt. It's like you didn't do anything wrong,
Mhm.
and that's okay. Of just kind of like keeping that in your mind and just moving forward like with grace and just being like, oh, I would like, I'm sorry that hurt you. That was never my intention. And just I found that like saying like an I'm sorry, like even if it's like you didn't do anything wrong, but like I'm sorry you feel that way can like help with a lot of things too.
Mm. Yeah, before we jump into our relationship goal, I want to add one more thing. And the more I think about it, the more I'm so glad we started this season off with rejection. That like if somebody brings in like expectation to you, like you are like allowed to say like no to that thing, especially if it feels like that makes me uncomfortable, that makes me feel unsafe.
Yeah.
That like you're right, and like always rooting it back in like consent, like you have autonomy over like the decisions that you make, what happens like to your body and all of those things. And so if whether a friend, a partner, some like a parent, granted, I mean like if a parent's just like I expect you to do the dishes, like I mean you should maybe do the dishes.
That's disappointing, but we
Maybe compromise like, hey, can I finish my homework and then do the dishes or something like that? So long as they're done by 6 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Dishes at 5 a.m.
Truly.
Like want to acknowledge that, but especially as we talk about the relationships and where equality is of utmost importance, friendships, relationships with coworkers, all of those things. That like it is okay to say no. Especially if something, you feel uncomfortable, that is unsafe. But you don't want that happening to yourself or body is really important too. And you should then expect that someone respect your no. And if they don't, then I would maybe exit that relationship. Or talk more about it. Back to boundaries. So any other final comments?
No, hit us with that relationship goal.
So this week, your relationship goal is to communicate one expectation that you have in a relationship with somebody, whether that's a sibling, a roommate, a partner. Talk about it with them and then ask how they feel about that expectation or what their own expectation is regarding that topic, and then move forward. So Kyla, recommendation?
Yes. So my recommendation for today and my recommendation for always is stretching and listening to your body's needs. So that can look like a lot of different things. One of the things that I do, whether like an internship or if I have like a full day of like classes and work, is I'll try to like take a minute to like just walk around, to get up from my chair, step outside. Seeing the sun is a remarkably good thing for my brain and my body. Like rolling your neck and shoulders, just kind of taking a minute to stretch like while you're sitting at your desk. And then like sometimes at night I like to do like a full full body yoga, like deep stretch sometimes, like stretch out my hips, stretch out my shoulders. And just like before I go to bed, because that's a good way to kind of like work on relieving tension from my body. And then something I've been starting to look at a little bit more is more of like intuitive eating. So like listening to what my body's needs are, of like sometimes I need something that's chocolatey, and that's okay. I'll have something that's small that's chocolatey. And sometimes what I want is fruit. I want fruit more than anything in the world. So I'll give my body fruit. So just kind of like listening to and responding to like eating when I'm hungry, and just kind of seeing what she needs and respecting that.
I like it.
Great, thank you. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us for episode 3. We'll be back with episode 4 next week and hope to see you there. Thanks so much for tuning in to Real-ationship Goals. This episode was produced by the Prevention and Education Department of the Advocacy Center for Crime Victims and Children in Waco, Texas. You can follow us on Instagram at ACCVC_prevention. See you next time.